Hi there, and welcome back to HauntingVeils. Tonight's mystery begins in the heart of St. Mary Mead, in a lovely little cottage, where a woman spent every day tending a garden that refused to grow. No matter how rich the soil, no matter how warm the sun, nothing ever bloomed there, until one morning when a single white flower appeared overnight, and beneath it, the police found what the earth had been hiding all along. When Miss Marple arrives, she realizes this garden was never meant for beauty. It was meant for burial, because in St. Mary Mead, even silence takes root, and the truth always finds its way to the surface. Stay with us till the end, and if you love mysteries where the earth itself keeps secrets, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to HauntingVeils. Chapter 1. The Garden That Would Not Grow. The afternoon sun lay pale and distant over the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, touching the thatched rooftops with a soft, golden haze. It was the kind of afternoon when time seemed to linger, when the ticking of the clock in the church tower felt almost sleepy. In Miss Marple's neat little sitting room, the curtains were half drawn to keep out the glare, and she sat by the window with her knitting needles flashing gently, her eyes, bright and watchful as ever, on the road below. At her age, Miss Marple knew that a village, for all its charm and peace, never truly slept. Beneath the smiles and the hedgerows, life had its undercurrents. A whisper here, a sudden silence there. And that was precisely why her interest was caught, that very day, by something as ordinary as a spade. It was in the hands of Mr. Arthur Green, the new tenant of Rosewood Cottage, a pleasant enough man, quiet, polite, and tidy about his garden. For weeks, she'd seen him digging in the same small patch of earth beside his fence. The trouble was, nothing ever grew there. Miss Marple, being the kind of lady who observed more than she was ever observed, had watched with patient curiosity. He had planted marigolds, then dahlias, then tulips. Each time, they failed to sprout. The rest of his garden bloomed with vigor. The roses climbed, the ivy spread, but that one square of ground remained stubbornly barren. She had mentioned it once to Mrs. Bantry, who was always delighted by a good piece of village gossip. "Strange, isn't it?" Miss Marple had said mildly, over a cup of tea. "You'd think something would grow there, at least a weed or two." "Perhaps it's poor soil," said Mrs. Bantry. "My gardener says some patches just don't take kindly to seeds." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "though I always say, if the earth refuses to grow, it's often because it's already full." Mrs. Bantry had laughed, assuming it was one of Miss Marple's little jokes. But Miss Marple had not laughed. She had simply sipped her tea and gazed out of the window, her eyes thoughtful and distant. It was a week later when the matter took a darker turn. Early one morning, the quiet of St. Mary Mead was broken by the sound of raised voices near Rosewood Cottage. Miss Marple, who was trimming her roses, glanced up to see Constable Pritchard standing by the gate, notebook in hand, while Mr. Green gestured rather nervously toward the ground. Curiosity was a natural quality in Miss Marple, not idle gossip, but genuine interest in human nature. She made her way down the lane with the deliberate unhurriedness of someone who always had reason to be exactly where she was. "Good morning, Constable," she said pleasantly. "I do hope nothing dreadful has happened." "Morning, Miss Marple," said Pritchard, tipping his hat. "Nothing dreadful, ma'am. Just a bit of mischief. Someone's been digging in Mr. Green's garden overnight. Looks like they were after his flower bed." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the barren patch. The soil was uneven, freshly turned, though oddly, not as if it had been dug by a stranger in haste, but rather as if something had been moved, then replaced. "How extraordinary," she murmured. "A thief who steals from empty earth." Mr. Green gave a nervous laugh. "I suppose boys from the village, Miss Marple, looking for worms or buried treasure." There's no harm done. But Miss Marple's gaze stayed on the earth. No harm at all, she said softly, if one believes in coincidence. That night, she couldn't sleep. The thought of that stubborn soil, the kind that refused to let anything grow, kept circling her mind. In her years in St. Mary Mead, she had seen too many little oddities to ignore this one. Gardens had a way of keeping secrets, and when the ground itself resisted growth, it was rarely because of the sun or the rain. The following morning brought with it a small but curious event. Miss Marple was in the market, exchanging a word with Mrs. Price, the greengrocer's wife, when a stranger caught her attention. He was a tall man, heavy-set, wearing a worn brown coat and hat pulled low. He wasn't from St. Mary Mead. That much was certain. She noticed the way he scanned faces, moving from stall to stall as though searching for someone. When his eyes landed briefly on her, he looked away quickly and crossed the street. But not before she saw something in his expression, a flicker of recognition. Later that afternoon, she saw him again. This time, he was near Rosewood Cottage. "Oh dear," she murmured as she watched from her garden gate. "Mr. Green does seem to have interesting company." The man stayed only a few minutes, speaking in low tones with Mr. Green by the gate, glancing up and down the lane. When he left, Mr. Green seemed pale, more so than usual, and immediately went to his barren patch of soil once more, kneeling to press the earth flat with both hands. Miss Marple watched until he went inside. Then, slowly, she walked to her own garden shed, where she fetched a small trowel. No one would call her nosy, at least not openly. But experience had taught her that evil often dressed itself in the plainest clothes. And she'd seen that look before, the look of a man who feared something buried more deeply than truth. That night brought rain. It came softly at first, then with sudden force, drumming against the windows and filling the air with the scent of wet earth. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her mind turning over small details like puzzle pieces. Mr. Green's nervous laugh, the stranger's furtive glances, the stubborn garden. Around midnight, unable to rest, she went to her window. The lane was dark, except for the faint glow of a lantern near Rosewood Cottage. A shadow moved there, slow, deliberate, digging in the rain. Miss Marple's breath caught. Mr. Green again. He worked for nearly an hour, then covered the hole and disappeared inside. She watched the garden for a long time after that. Rain could wash away footprints, but it could not wash away suspicion. In the morning, she paid a visit under the polite excuse of returning a misplaced newspaper. Mr. Green greeted her at the door, his face drawn. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, attempting cheerfulness. "Good morning, Mr. Green. I found your paper on my gate. Must have blown over in the wind." He thanked her, but his hands trembled slightly as he took it. Her eyes drifted to the patch of earth. The rain had made the soil heavy and slick, but something had changed. The ground was flatter now, tamped down with unusual care. "Your garden looks quite industrious," she said kindly. "Though that bit still refuses to grow, I see." He forced a smile. "Yes, odd thing, isn't it? I might give it up altogether." "Oh, I shouldn't think so," said Miss Marple. "Gardens have a way of giving back what we plant, sooner or later." And with that, she left, her mind quite certain that whatever had been planted there, it was not a seed. 2 days later, the village children were playing ball near Rosewood Cottage when one of them, little Tommy Briggs, ran home crying. His mother found him pale and shaking, clutching his nose. "It smells bad, Mum," he said, "by the fence, like something dead." The story spread quickly, as stories did in St. Mary Mead. By afternoon, Constable Pritchard was again at the cottage, and half the village watched from a polite distance as he and Mr. Green inspected the patch. Miss Marple did not watch. She waited at home, knitting in silence until the sound of hurried footsteps came down the lane. "Miss Marple!" cried Mrs. Bantry, breathless. "They found something." And they had. Under 2 feet of compacted soil, beneath the roots of wilted marigolds, they uncovered a small wooden box. Old, rotting, but sealed tight. Inside was not what anyone expected. No creature, no animal, but rather the bones of a human hand, wrapped carefully in linen. By evening, the village was alive with whispers. Mr. Green had been taken for questioning. The police cordoned off the garden. Everyone speculated wildly. An old crime, perhaps, or something even darker. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly, sipping her tea, her eyes far away. A single hand, she said softly to herself. Not a whole body. Someone wanted it hidden, but not forgotten. It was a curious thing, she thought. Why bury part of a person, and not all? Unless, perhaps, it was not murder at all, but a message. When Inspector Craddock arrived from the county station, he came directly to Miss Marple's cottage. "I thought you might have an idea, Miss Marple," he said. "You usually do." She smiled faintly. "You're very kind, Inspector. But I dare say the garden itself will tell us everything once it's ready to speak." "Do you mean you think there's more buried there?" "Oh, no," she said quietly. "Not more. But someone alive who knows what was put there and why." Her gaze drifted toward the darkened outline of Rosewood Cottage beyond the lane. The garden lay still under the moonlight, the earth disturbed, its secret half revealed. And Miss Marple, who understood that evil rarely hides far from home, knew this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Roots Beneath the Roses. Rain had washed the village clean overnight, leaving the air sharp with the scent of wet stone and honeysuckle. By morning, St. Mary Mead had already recovered from the shock, or so it seemed. In truth, the discovery at Rosewood Cottage had become the silent heartbeat of every conversation, from the grocer's shop to the vicarage garden. Miss Marple, however, kept her thoughts to herself. She had lived long enough to know that truth took its time to bloom, much like roses after frost. A visit from Inspector Craddock. Inspector Craddock came to see her again that morning. His manner was brisk but thoughtful, and though he had dealt with Miss Marple before, he never underestimated her quiet mind. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, stepping into the sitting room. "I thought you might be interested to hear the results of our search." "Always, Inspector," she said gently. "Do sit down. You look as though you've had a long night." He smiled faintly and lowered himself into the chair opposite her. "We've confirmed the bones are human, ma'am. Female, from what the pathologist can tell, and at least 20 years old." 20 years, Miss Marple repeated softly. "How time preserves the things we wish to forget." "We've checked the old records," he continued. "No missing persons that fit the age or time. The cottage changed hands twice since then. First a family named Redmond, then a widow called Mrs. Lyle. Mr. Green only moved in this spring." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she thought. "Mrs. Lyle, you say? The one who lost her husband in that accident. Oh, it must be 15 years ago now." "That's right. Car went off the bridge near Old Mill Lane." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Curious. I remember her garden being well kept, especially the roses." "Roses?" Craddock repeated. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "She was quite proud of them. Yet I recall her telling me once that there was one patch by the fence that she refused to plant in. Said the earth there gave her an uneasy feeling." Craddock's brow furrowed. "That same patch. I believe so." He rose from his seat, frowning thoughtfully. "I think, Miss Marple, you've just given me reason to dig deeper, figuratively speaking." "I do hope so," she said, her eyes glinting. "For you see, gardens remember what their keepers forget." The widow who remembered. By afternoon, Miss Marple decided to pay a call on Mrs. Lyle, who now lived in a small cottage near the vicarage. She was a frail woman in her 70s, pale and delicate, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the tea. "Oh, Miss Marple, how dreadful about Rosewood Cottage," she said, her voice wavering. "I can hardly believe it. I lived there for years and never suspected a thing." Miss Marple nodded. "You were very fond of the place, I recall." "Indeed, though it always felt strange somehow. There were times when I'd swear I heard footsteps by the fence at night. I even told my husband once, but he said it was nonsense." "In the garden?" asked Miss Marple gently. "You had roses, did you not?" "Oh yes, beautiful ones. Except that one corner. I could never get anything to grow there, no matter how hard I tried. I used to joke that the soil was cursed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps not cursed, Mrs. Lyle, merely occupied." Mrs. Lyle looked puzzled. "Occupied? By memory, my dear. Some places hold on to it longer than others." They spoke for a few more minutes, about the cottage, the neighbors, and the years gone by, but one small remark stood out. "There was a man," Mrs. Lyle said suddenly. "I'd almost forgotten. A visitor years ago, before my husband's accident. He came looking for someone. A woman, I think. He seemed quite upset when I told him we'd only live there a short while." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Do you recall his name?" Mrs. Lyle frowned, her memory dim. "No, only that he had a limp, and he carried a pocket watch he kept checking over and over. I remember the ticking. It was loud, very loud." Miss Marple left soon after, her mind working quietly. A man with a limp. A missing woman. A buried hand. 20 years ago. It was beginning to take shape, though faintly, like a photograph developing in darkness. Mr. Green's secret. That evening, the air hung heavy with mist. The lane between Rosewood Cottage and the church was nearly silent, except for the hoot of an owl. Miss Marple, on her nightly walk, paused as she saw a flicker of light in Mr. Green's window. Curiosity tugged at her, but not without caution. She waited by her gate until she saw him step outside. He looked exhausted, his face pale, his eyes haunted. He held a letter in one hand and walked slowly toward the post box at the end of the lane. When he was gone, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to his garden again. The police had finished their work there, leaving the soil turned and raw. Yet as the mist swirled, she saw something small glinting faintly in the dirt, a bit of metal catching the lantern light. The next morning, she visited under a simple pretext. "Just bringing you some cuttings, Mr. Green," she said cheerfully. "Rosemary and thyme. They do wonders for the soil." "You're very kind, Miss Marple," he said, forcing a tired smile. Her gaze moved to the ground. "They didn't find anything else, I hope?" "No," he said quickly. "Nothing else." "Ah," she murmured. "Strange how the earth hides things. Even the smallest token can lie hidden for years." He stiffened slightly, his eyes flicking to hers. "What do you mean?" "Only that gardens have long memories," she said softly. "Especially the ones that won't grow." She left him then, but not before noticing something remarkable. The faint outline of a small circular mark on his wrist, as though from a watch strap long removed. A name from the past. Inspector Craddock returned that afternoon, and this time Miss Marple was ready for him. "You might find this of interest," she said, handing him a folded page torn from an old parish bulletin. "The St. Mary Mead fate 20 years ago. Note the name." He glanced down. "Arthur Green. That's impossible. Our Mr. Green said he'd never been here before this year." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "But it seems he was once employed as a gardener for the Redmond family, at Rosewood Cottage." Craddock frowned. "You're suggesting he's not who he claims to be?" "I'm suggesting he never left," she said quietly. "At least, not in his heart." "Then who's the woman buried there?" Miss Marple's knitting paused. "I believe she was someone Mr. Green cared for deeply. Perhaps too deeply." "You mean, love, Inspector, could be a dangerous thing, especially when it's not returned." She told him then of Mrs. Lyle's visitor, the man with the limp, and the watch that ticked too loudly. That visitor, I think, was Mr. Green himself, years before he took the name Green. The name is too convenient. Green, the gardener. A fresh start, perhaps. A cover for something that never left him. Craddock leaned back, stunned. So he came back to the same cottage years later? To the same patch of earth, said Miss Marple, because something of his was still buried there. The confession. That night, St. Mary Mead was restless again. A storm rolled in from the west, rumbling low across the fields. And in the midst of it, footsteps echoed down the lane. Miss Marple opened her door before the knock came. Mr. Green stood there, drenched and shaking. "Miss Marple," he said hoarsely, "I can't do this anymore." She guided him inside, set him by the fire, and handed him a blanket. "You've come to tell me the truth," she said simply. He nodded, tears cutting through the dirt on his face. "Her name was Lydia," he whispered. "I work for the Redmonds. She was their maid. We planned to run away together, but she changed her mind. Said she'd marry someone else. I begged her. We argued, and she fell. She hit her head on the stones by the fence." "And you buried her," said Miss Marple gently. "I was terrified. I thought they'd hang me. So I hid her hand. It had my ring on it. I thought if they never found it, they'd never know. But I couldn't stay away. I came back after all these years. To make it right." Miss Marple's voice was soft but steady. "You cannot make right what's been hidden in lies. But you can end it." He nodded slowly. "I've written everything down. It's in that letter. For the police." They sat in silence as thunder rolled above. When he finally left, his shoulders were lighter, though his future would not be. Miss Marple watched him walk down the lane toward the station, his figure swallowed by the storm. She did not feel triumph, only the quiet ache of truth uncovered. The roses returned. Days passed. The case was closed, and the village returned to its gentle rhythm. Mr. Green's real name was revealed in the papers, Thomas Harrow, and though his crime was long past, he faced judgment with quiet acceptance. One morning, Miss Marple took her pruning shears and walked to Rosewood Cottage. The soil, now freshly turned and tended by new caretakers, had begun to show signs of life. A small green shoot had broken through the dirt, fragile but determined. Miss Marple knelt beside it, brushing the soil gently with her fingertips. "The earth forgives," she murmured, "but it never forgets." She straightened, the morning light catching the soft silver in her hair, and walked home through the lane, her footsteps steady and sure. Behind her, in the once barren garden, the roses began to grow again. Chapter 3. The Bloom of the Truth. The morning after the storm, St. Mary Mead awoke to silence. The clouds had passed, leaving the village washed and glistening beneath a pale blue sky. The air was cool, carrying the smell of damp earth and cut grass. For most of the villagers, the events at Rosewood Cottage were already fading into memory, a story to whisper about over tea, a tale to tell the newcomers. But for Miss Marple, the matter had not yet ended. There was still something missing, a truth not yet uncovered. The letter, the confession Mr. Green, Thomas Harrow, had written was now in Inspector Craddock's hands. Yet something in his account troubled Miss Marple. It was too neat, too convenient. She sat by her window, knitting untouched in her lap, her eyes fixed on the lane. "People rarely tell the truth all at once," she murmured to herself. "They offer in pieces, the part they can live with." That afternoon, Inspector Craddock came calling again. He looked weary, the kind of tired that sits behind the eyes. "He's taken responsibility for it all," Craddock said. "Says it was an accident, but that he hid it out of fear. We found old employment records that confirm his story. The name Harrow checks out." "And the body?" asked Miss Marple quietly. "What we've recovered so far matches his account. The bones beneath the roses were hers, Lydia's." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I see. It's remarkable, really," he continued. "After all these years, the case finally solved. Closure at last." She smiled faintly. "Closure, Inspector, is rarely the same as peace." Craddock frowned. You think there's more to it? I think, said Miss Marple, that the earth might yet have one more secret to give up. The photograph. That evening, Miss Marple went through an old stack of parish newsletters, her fingers nimble despite their age. The pages smelled of dust and lavender. She found what she was looking for, a photograph of the Rosewood Cottage garden, taken 20 years ago for the village flower show. There, among the smiling faces and blooming roses, was Lydia, the maid. Young, dark-haired, with an expression both kind and wary. Beside her stood another man. Not Thomas Harrow, someone older, sterner. His hand rested lightly on Lydia's shoulder, possessive, not affectionate. The caption read, Mr. and Mrs. Redmond with staff, Rosewood Cottage, 1907. Miss Marple studied it for a long moment, then reached for her coat. The visit. Inspector Craddock was surprised to see her at the station so late in the evening. Miss Marple, surely you're not walking out alone at this hour? I've walked St. Mary Mead lanes longer than most, Inspector. I came because there's something I must say before it's too late. He gestured for her to sit. Go on. She placed a photograph on his desk. You see this man? Mr. Redmond, the master of the house. Lydia worked for him. You'll find that Mrs. Redmond died not long after this picture was taken. Pneumonia, I believe the papers said. And a few months later, Lydia disappeared. Craddock leaned forward. You're suggesting Mr. Redmond was involved? No, said Miss Marple softly. I'm suggesting that Lydia's death was not the accident Thomas Harrow believes it to be. I think she was already dead when he found her. Craddock's eyes widened. Already dead? Yes. You see, Lydia was planning to leave the Redmonds' employ. She knew something worth killing for. Mr. Redmond was a proud man, but pride can rot into fear. I believe he killed her in anger, and Thomas Harrow, in his devotion, helped cover it up, believing himself to blame. The inspector sat back heavily. That's quite a theory. Not theory, Inspector. Intuition. The kind of garden gives you after years of watching things grow and die. The truth unearthed. 2 days later, under Miss Marple's quiet urging, the police returned to Rosewood Cottage for one final search. This time, they dug not by the fence, but beneath the roses themselves, where the soil had seemed disturbed even before Harrow's confession. And there, beneath the roots, they found what Miss Marple had expected all along. A second body, older, male, Mr. Redmond. The coroner's report confirmed the rest. He had been dead for nearly as long as Lydia, perhaps a year less. Poison. Thomas Harrow, it seemed, had returned to the cottage years later, not to hide guilt, but to deliver justice. The final conversation. When Miss Marple visited him in the holding cell, he looked thinner, older, but calmer. You knew, didn't you? He said softly. I suspected, she replied. You buried him beneath the roses. He nodded. I couldn't let her rest while he walked free. I waited years, but in the end, I came back. I dug where I'd buried her, and beneath her I laid him. She would never be alone again. Miss Marple's eyes were kind but grave. You loved her, more than anything. But love, Miss Marple, love made me both her protector and her jailer. She said nothing for a while, only listened to the quiet hum of the corridor beyond. You know, she said finally, gardens can teach us a great deal about life. Things grow, things fade. But in the end, truth, like a seed, always finds its way to the light. He smiled faintly, tears glinting in his eyes. Then maybe she's free now? Yes, said Miss Marple softly. At last, the bloom of the truth. Weeks passed, and the case faded again into history. The papers told the story in their tidy way. Village garden yields decades-old mystery. But Miss Marple knew that no newspaper could ever capture the quiet ache of a truth long hidden. She visited Rosewood Cottage one last time in early spring. The garden had changed, lighter now, cleaner. New tenants had moved in, unaware of the lives buried beneath their feet. The roses, once stubborn and still, were in full bloom. Deep crimson, heavy with dew. They bowed gently in the wind, as though in memory. Miss Marple stood there for a long time, the morning sunlight soft on her face. Then she reached down, brushed a fallen petal from the soil, and whispered, "The garden that never grew has finally learned to live again." As she turned to leave, the church bells rang across St. Mary Mead, steady, solemn, and strangely hopeful. That evening, in her sitting room, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and opened her diary. On a fresh page, she wrote, "The truth blooms in its own time. The earth may hide it, fear may silence it, but in the end, it always grows." She smiled, closed the book, and looked out at her own garden, where the first buds of spring were opening. Life, she thought, had a way of balancing itself, no matter how long it took. And as the final light of day faded beyond St. Mary Mead, the story of the garden that never grew drew to a quiet close. If you enjoyed stepping once more into Miss Marple's world, where quiet observation unearths the darkest of secrets, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more mysteries every week. Because in this village of whispers and roses, there's always another secret waiting to bloom.